Okay. Hello. My name is Jared Arnofsky. I've been working with Sitecore for a little over a decade. Um, two-time Sitecore MVP. Um, this year being my second time getting it. I've worked on Sitecore since the 7.2 days and up to now, most recently, XM Cloud. I primarily focus on headless development and XM Cloud. And I live in the greater Boston area with my wife and my 5-year-old son. And I'm a solution architect at AmericanEagle.com. All right. So the title of this presentation is Sitecore X and Cloud Wildcard Pages in Sitecore Search. So this is what we did for our most recent Sitecore Search / XM Cloud project. It was Next.js, the headless application, and it was based off the Sitecore starter repository. And we did use Vercel to host, but I'm probably not going to get into the details of the Vercel stuff, or some of the project code. But you can always reach out and ask me if you have some more questions. I'm going to try to keep it high level. And then again, this is what worked for us. XM Cloud and Sitecore Search are constantly evolving. They're SaaS products. So even though we built this project with the best practices in mind, things can change. So this was for a large healthcare provider serving over 1 million members, and they had like 6 or 10,000 providers across multiple locations. And then in the past, I've given talks specifically in this user group and others about setting up Sitecore Search, crawler, sitemaps. I'm not going to dive into building the Sitecore Search implementation itself. Again, I've previously done a user group here at the Sitecore Pittsburgh user group, and there's a video of it on YouTube if you'd like to see. I'm going to specifically focus on getting data into XM Cloud, which could be used for the search, but in our case, it's going to be used for the wildcard pages. But if you'd like to know more about building out the search itself, you can check out one of my earlier videos from this year. Okay, just a quick background information. So for those that are new to Sitecore Search, Sitecore defines it as an AI-driven headless content delivery platform that you create predictive and personalized search experiences, and you can pull in multiple content sources. Essentially, Sitecore Search is just a product in the Sitecore's DXP system. It gives you some nice features. It has built-in AI, predictive search. You can rank and change fields. Your normal enterprise like search solution. And again, I'm not going to go into building the search itself, but I'm going to talk about wildcard pages specifically. So then one more thing I just want to show, like if you are interested in learning more about Sitecore Search, like in this project, we leverage the React SDK. There's a nice CLI. There's a storybook implementation the Sitecore built, so you can further look into that or check out my previous user group presentation. Again, I'm not going to go into the details. And then there's some background information. A wildcard page, which is what we'll be talking about today. Essentially, it's a single built page that dynamically shows data, and you can control and set the presentation details once. So essentially, in my example, testsite.com/providers and then /0, 1, 2, 3, 4, those numbers. What I'm getting at is we could have 6,000 providers in our system. When I go to my website, testsite.com/providers, the number at the end is my identifier, so the NPI number for those familiar with healthcare, and that's how we can dynamically load our data into this page. So you can see my crude drawing on the right. That would be like an example of a provider detail page, which is what I'm calling a wildcard page. So for the agenda, we'll talk about the Sitecore Search API crawling. So essentially, how do we get our data into the index? And again, this data that gets into the index is going to be used for a provider search in the grand scheme of the project. So I'm going to show you how we get that data in there. But since the data is in there and we're using it for a search, we might as well use it to resolve our wildcard pages as well. Next, I'll go into the wildcard setup for what you have to do from the XM Cloud side. Some of that stuff's familiar from the old school days, XP. And then I'll talk about the Next.js headless app and what we had to do to change it. And some of the SEO sitemap changes that we need to do to accommodate. So Sitecore search API crawling. So you can see in my little diagram here, essentially we have our source. So the top block is Sitecore search. We have our source, our JavaScript trigger, our document extractor, and then in the external system, we have an API, and per record, we get the data. So source is what is the thing we're crawling, the website XYZ, for example, or you know, maybe it's an API in our example. So the source that it represents in Sitecore search. So in this particular example, it would be like providers. We call it the providers source. And then the JS trigger, it's like that's how we script our trigger and add logic. What do we look at to index our data? And then the document extractor for each like entry in our trigger. How do we get like what is the data that we're getting? And then our external system is the API, and you have data per record. So we worked with the client to build out an API. You could expose data in different ways. It doesn't have to be this way, but for like a big, healthcare provider, they already had an API that we could leverage, and then we could fine tune it with the schema so we could get what we needed. So it was a really good fit. This is just a small sampling of data just to get the point across. That's true for the whole presentation. I'm not showing all the fields and all the data. I've simplified it and slimmed it down for just example purposes. But essentially, we work with the client to identify um, a a schema for our data, for our JSON data. You can see on line 6, we have our collection of providers. And then starting on line 7, that's our first provider. Line 37, we would start into our second provider, 6,000 providers, et cetera. And then we have some fields that we've defined. So these are all, our data attributes. So we have our NPI number, we have, our name, maybe you have some locations, et cetera. And then the Sitecore search, we create a new source in the API crawler, of type API crawler, right? And then you can create a JavaScript trigger. And your JavaScript trigger is essentially, it's a trigger that lets you add in logic and conditions. You have full JavaScript availability in there. So in this project, we couldn't get all of the records at once. It would crash the API. So we had to paginate through. So in the JSON data, you could see that we had a total records and a pagination set. So we worked with the client and their internal team to build an API that has pagination. And then in here, you can see that we set a total record size. We set it to like 10,000. There's probably never going to be 10,000 records. And then we can set a page size. You can also do like multi-threading and figure out what works best for you in Sitecore search. I think we actually ended up doing 10 threads which is the max at a time. So for like 6 or 7,000 records, I think we can get through them in like 4 or 5 minutes. And if you did a single thread, it's significantly longer. But you just need to, work with the API and within Sitecore search to figure out what works best, and that worked for us. And you can see in here that we have our base URL. You notice that we have an API key in there. One limitation that we found was you can add a header key value in Sitecore search, but within the trigger, the JavaScript trigger itself, you can't add headers. So we had to add a key to the query string. It's not ideal. However, your API on the client side that was built, you can also lock that down to Sitecore's crawling IPs. So Sitecore gives you a list of IPs that you can whitelist for Sitecore search. So with the whitelisting of only allowed crawlable IPs to the API and the query string API key, we felt that was locked down enough for us to get around that blocker. So again, we just go through and paginate the simple for each loop, and we go through every record. And then we set up a document extractor. So that's how we get data on every record. So previously we got all the records, and now we need to figure out how we get the data out of every record. So this is the document extractor. The extractor runs using Cheerio syntax. It's like a fast, flexible library for parsing HTML and XML. It's a subset core of jQuery, I believe. And it again, it's just really performant and easy to use for like parsing XML and HTML. So in our extractor, you can hard code data, you can put in some logic, etc. So I have just a small sampling of our data set here. And you can see that we have an array of requests on line 2, and on line 25, we return our array of requests. And then on line 3, you can see that we loop through every record um, that was in our collection. So we can return lines 6 through 21. Those are examples of fields within our index. So maybe the ID, which is the NPI number, which is important. We need a unique identifier for every provider in our system. So NPI fits the bill there. And in Sitecore Search, you need each record to have a unique identifier as well. So this maps to the API, each of the JSON fields, and then puts them together into the index fields. And then this is your attributes within Sitecore Search. And you can set up, this lets you control if like a field is a facet or a filter, et cetera, but what the data type is. But most importantly, you see on the far right, it says return an API response. If you want to be able to return, return data from a API call to Sitecore Search, you need to have that box checked per field to see it in the API response. And then lastly, you can set up a crawler schedule. So we have this thing run every day, and that's controllable in Sitecore Search. And then you can see in here in the content browser, we can see that we have our source providers, we have our test doctor, and we have an ID for that test doctor. And then if we click into that record, I've slimmed it down a little bit. You can see we have this test doctor, we have their ID, which is the NPI number, and then maybe a content type is provider, and then you have more fields there, locations, specialties, etc. But just for example purposes, I'm slimming it down here. So that's how all the data gets into Sitecore Search. And again, the understanding would be you've built or you've already built a Sitecore Search experience using the React SDK that I talked about in the beginning to search all of that provider data. But now that the provider data is in that index, we might as well use it for wildcard pages. So now I'm going to get into the wildcard setup within XMCloud. So on the left, you'll see in our tree, we have a test tenant and a test site. And then under home, we have providers, and then we have a star item. So this is probably pretty familiar to most of us that have been working in Sitecore for a while. That's just the wildcard page approach. So any value that could be under providers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, will get routed to that star page. And on that star page, you can see that we have a provider detail component, and it has a data source, and that maps one-to-one with our Next.js component. So we can control the details, the look, etc. of that component just one time on this start page, rather than making 6,000 individual doctor pages. And there's nothing stopping you in the Next.js side to handle this outside of Sitecore. You could use pages routes and make a provider page and make it handle outside of Sitecore completely. We decided to put it in Sitecore like this because we want to be able to handle maybe dictionary items for like headings, and we have multiple languages, so we want to translate, as well as like maybe we want to add another component globally across every provider. I guess what I'm getting at is if you want to, control the presentation details more, it's a nice fit to manage it this way in Sitecore as opposed to just in the headless app on its own. So then you can see in this example, if it was site.com/providers/12345, that star item would get resolved. So that's all we had to do in the Sitecore portion. And then the last part we have to do is in the headless application. So again, we're using Next.js based off of the starter that Sitecore provides us. So in the path.tsx, this is the the route that everything gets, it's the wildcard page that everything gets caught in to resolve your item from Sitecore. That's how the starter works. That's how Next.js handles your Sitecore pages. So we modified the path TSX. So you can see the slug on line 97, I believe. Yep. We have providers. And then you can see that on line 101, we check to see if that path, we look, is there a path? We have some just basic checking, but we say, is this providers? Meaning, does the URL have /providers in it? And then we check the last part of the URL, and we have on line 104, we have a regular expression because we're looking for a 10-digit number. We're looking for an MPI number, which is 10 digits. So then we can check to see what was that specific ID. And then you can see on line 107, this is the part that you have to do in the Next.js app to make it work with that star page. So if it has if is providers, meaning if the path contains the URL for providers, and if it matches the regular expression for is specific ID, then we can set the Sitecore context params path to the slug providers, and then this slash comma dash w dash comma, which is just saying string. So it's saying slash physician slash anything that's a string. So in our case, as long as it passed is specific ID, it would be the 10-digit number that goes there. So now, as far as Sitecore is concerned, it's routing through the path TSX. It finds the /providers path, and then the star object is representative of anything in comma dash w dash. In the provider details.tsx, we added a here, let me take a step back. So this is what we had to do to make it so the wildcard page resolves properly. Then the next step is on the provider details page. So we've made a provider detail.tsx, meaning we've made a provider detail component. And I'm not going into all the details of the component. It's just a React component that we've built. However, we have added to our component, you'll see on line 62, we're using use query. It's a React query. So on page load, we define a response, which I'll get into in the next slide, but we define a response, and then we do our fetch provider call using that ID that we extracted. So you can see on our next slide, this is the response. This response is what the Sitecore search API returns to us. So on our provider detail component that is set up on our star wildcard page, on page load, we call the Sitecore search API, and we're looking for this response, provider search response. Widget is part of what comes back from Sitecore search, and then RFK ID is the ID specifically, and then other fields and content is the stuff that we've added in. So that's our response object. And then you can see we have a provider details.tsx. We have our wildcard. It says wildcard. Apologies. Let's just say wildcard item and component. So this does an Axios call. So this is fetching the provider. I believe since I've written this, fetch is built into Next.js, the newest version of Next.js. You could do fetch, you could do Axios. It doesn't matter. Essentially, what you're doing is you're fetching the provider data, and then we built an API route for provider details where we pass that ID. You could do it client side. There's nothing stopping you. We decided to put it in the API route just so we could put some more control around it. So once we call the API call, in the get provider data, API that we just referenced, you can see on line 14, this is our query to Sitecore search. So it's a simple post. You pass it the next public search API URL. So you can see on the bottom, I've pasted that in. It's discover.sitecorecloud.io/discover. I think discover was maybe a product or a different product that Sitecore search is or became, etc. But that is the URL that we use to leverage the API. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in that URL, that's the source ID, I believe. Oh, sorry, maybe the domain ID. It's the domain ID, yeah. And we specify the domain ID, and then you can see on line 20, we specify the source. So your source would be like the ID in Sitecore search for the provider source. And then you can see on line 26, we pass the ID, which was the NPI number. And then other than that, we're just saying, look at the provider source and then filter it, give me all the content and filter it where it's equal to the ID. That is the value that I passed in, limit 1. So it's pretty much just saying, give me the first record that matches this ID. And again, the NPI is unique, so we're only going to get 1 record back. So now we have gotten the record back from Sitecore search. And then in our component, again, I'm not going into all the details. I'm kind of going high level here. In our component, we can just display that object within the React component. So in this approach, we're still able to do SSG on our page if we'd like to. We can still get all of the component props, all of the page props, just like we would in any other React component in our Next.js application. However, we've made now a provider details object where we take the response of what Sitecore search gave back to us, which would be, an MPI record for a provider with all of the fields and all of the data. And then we essentially make like a POCO object where we take what Sitecore search gives back to us and then maps it to our data object. And then now within our provider details React component, we can, put those fields in our rendering where it belongs. And then one other thing I want to talk about when we do all of this work, now we have these dynamic pages that load data for providers. However, we don't have like a real page, quote unquote, for each provider page. So we do have some SEO considerations that we need to think about. So what we ended up doing was we want to have all of the URLs for our providers, but we don't have them in our sitemap because they're not real pages. So we had to think about a solution and how to get them there, because for SEO reasons, we do want to crawl all of our providers, and it's a pretty common thing. So what we ended up doing was we created a sitemap index, and we reference our original sitemap within that index, and then we add a provider sitemap.xml to it. So you'll see here in the pages/API/sitemap.ts, this is in the starter project. You'll see we just modified it. So you'll see on line number, line number 35, if sitemap path. We're just checking to see like, is the path for the sitemap one-to-one with /sitemap.xml? If it is, just show the sitemap.xml. And then you can see on line number 53, that's for if it didn't return on line 41. This is where we generate the sitemap index. So essentially, if it's anything other than sitemap.xml, it falls into line 52. You could further extend this and make it more complex, but we only had this one use case, so we kept it pretty simple. So essentially what we do is we're just piggybacking on the original sitemap creation, and then on line 54, we're adding in sitemap providers.xml. And then we're building out the sitemap index. You can see on line 67, those are all of our entries. So the 2 entries, the base sitemap and now the sitemap providers. And then we've modified the code on the bottom, line 76, to now bring into a sitemap index with those 2 links. So now you'll see here, this is what it looks like. So if I go to sitemap.xml, it still loads my sitemap.xml with all my web pages as it should. If I do sitemap-index.xml, it will now render this, what you're seeing here. And we've piped in the second entry for sitemap providers. So now from SEO perspective, we can change our robots.txt to look at sitemap index, and now it'll have the website in all of the pages as well as the sitemap providers in those two files. And then to make that work, we need to essentially we copied the sitemap.ts and then modified it. So we made a new API route called pages/API/sitemap-providers.ts. And then you can see essentially all we did here is we query Sitecore search. I've trimmed out some of the stuff here, like we cache it, we read from the cache, maybe cache for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, etc. But essentially you can see on lines 36, etc., that, this is a very similar query to what we did before when we called the Sitecore search API. So we give it the URL, base URL that we've previously talked about. We give it the source ID, and then this time we can say limit, max limit. So give me everything. And then once we get it all, we go through them all. And then you can see we put together our sitemap. So you can see we dynamically loop through and then we add each record. And then on the bottom, you can see that we do have some leftover stuff from the caching that I left in there. And then lastly, to make it so sitemap providers.xml actually loads, we had to add a rewrite. So we add a new one. So it says source. So if someone goes to /sitemap-providers.xml, in the next config.js, there's a rewrite section, and we can say using this source, make it this destination. So if someone goes to sitemap-providers.xml, it'll redirect them to /API/sitemap-providers, and then it'll dynamically build that page for them. And then you can see in the sitemap providers, there'll be, many records, but this is just a subset of those records, and they live here like that. Okay, and then for just insights and learnings, it takes a lot of time to organize and standardize and get all the data it takes for a wildcard implementation. I'd say most of our time was spent working with the client and stakeholders to figure out what are the fields in the index, what are the fields and how do they map to the fields in the API, and then more importantly, I kind of glossed over it without without showing it, but the detail pages can be pretty complicated, where providers may have many locations, and based on locations, they may have other fields of data, and they may show differently as well. So just doing all of that work and figuring out what data you need on your pages, how you're presenting that data, helps you inform how you're going to organize it in your JSON data from the API so that you can then put it into Sitecore search so your detail page can consume it. So yeah, again, the implementation is relatively straightforward, but paying attention to the small details and working through the schema, it's probably the most difficult part. And then when building out our Sitecore search implementation, the wildcard approach, it was a good fit because we already built the search at this time for the provider data. So, in the old days, we may have taken all of the provider data and then made Sitecore items out of it and thrown them into the CMS. But in XM Cloud, you're not supposed to modify the CMS anymore. But then, so you kind of have to think maybe a little bit more outside of the box of how we could solve this. But then, in addition to that, it's kind of like, does that data even need to exist in the CMS anymore anyways? So then once you start thinking about that, and because the data was already in the search index, we might as well leverage it using the API and the tools that they give us. So now when someone goes to a page, it's quick, it's fast, and the data gets called out of the index, super fast to load the page, and it's a really good fit. And yeah, any questions, comments?
I think that was pretty good, Jared. Thank you very much.
Cool.
I don't see any questions. I think we should be good. Thank you for taking time and walking through this
Yeah,
whole implementation, man. Been
thank you.
insightful.
Thank you for having me.